We're continuing just for the next couple of weeks to only have Alex Bavanwi in the Zendo, just because we're waiting till everyone has their booster shot. So I'm joining you on Zoom. I'd like to talk today about one of the early sutras, the Mahayana Mahaparinirvana Sutra, often referred to as just the Nirvana Sutra, a particular parable out of that sutra. And the reason that we do any of this, study any sutras or talk about any part of the Buddha's teachings, is always to remember that our intention is to relieve suffering in the world, which comes about actually by a better apprehension of what reality is. So our purpose is always to relieve suffering and cultivate compassion. And with that goes a sense of intimacy and unity with all things. So this particular sutra was written in Sanskrit. The oral teachings of the Buddha passed on in around about the 2nd century of the Common Era, written down in Sanskrit. And since then, there's only fragments of that original sutra left, but it was translated into Chinese and Tibetan. And the version that I'm going to read from is the English version translated by Mark Plume. And it's kind of interesting for us as Zen practitioners to sometimes read these early parable stories that are closer to the Buddha's time. They have a different flavor to them and slightly different kind of way of thinking than what we're used to, just culturally slightly different. And I think it can sometimes actually help us to understand the teachings a little differently and maybe a little more deeply, just because it's coming from a slightly different angle to what we're accustomed to. We're hearing words presented in a different way and images presented in a different way. So this, in the Nirvana Sutra, there's a number of parables that use the metaphor of milk as medicine, and the milk in the story is symbolic for both the conventional sense of self in the traditions of India before Buddhism arose, the idea of there being a soul, a sort of separate entity, sort of an atomic kind of sense of self. Each person is a separate self that lives on, from the beginning of life to the end and through countless lives. And also the sense of self in the more conventional sense of identification with I am who I think I am. And it's important for me to identify with that and protect it and promote it, or what the various things we each do with that sense of personal self. And the metaphor of milk also shifts in its meaning throughout this particular parable from that earlier sense of self to the more Buddha nature teachings sense of self, which we can call like the true self, or the self with a capital S, true absolute reality, true reality. So the metaphor of milk kind of shifts throughout this parable in its meaning. And it's quite a long passage that I'm going to read, and I'll stop periodically and say things, but at the end we can come back and go over it together, because it is definitely an unusual story. And I love this story because I heard it the first time at No Abode with Tenshin Roshi Reb Anderson told this story, and I was very captivated by it. So I'm kind of glad to be able to share it with you today. Okay, so reading from the English translation of the Nirvana Sutra. And this whole sutra is like quite a few hundred pages long. So this is just one of many, many parables in the sutra. Consider this parable. There was once a king of little wisdom. Serving him was a physician whose nature was also rather dull. Yet as the king was unable to distinguish such things, He gave the physician a very generous official salary. And I just wanted to make this point right at the beginning, that all of us are somewhat like the king of little wisdom and the physician who is rather dull. that we all have our shortcomings, and that sometimes we make the mistake in our life of thinking someone else is wiser than they are, and then we have to learn our lesson. And that's just part of our human condition, and that's okay. It even happened to this king. The doctor, his physician, treated a host of illnesses by simply prescribing milk, for he did not understand the causes of the ailments for which he was faced. Although he knew that milk was often not particularly efficacious as medicine, whatever illness he encountered, he administered milk. And the king, on his part, could not discern if the physician himself understood what was beneficial or deleterious, good or bad, in his medicinal use of milk. Now there also happened to be a brilliant physician in the kingdom, quite proficient in all 8 technical disciplines of healing. He responded skillfully to whatever ailment he encountered, because he was aware of all known medicinal treatments. People came from great distances to see him. It did not occur to the king's physician to seek him out for consultation. Instead, the elder physician displayed arrogance and contempt toward him. At that time, however, the brilliant physician put himself in a dependent relationship with the king's physician, requesting that the older man become his teacher. And the older physician agreed. So as I read through this, I'm leaving out sections because otherwise it would just take too long. So I'm kind of pulling forward the most critical pieces for the purpose of this talk. The king's physician then brought him, the brilliant physician, into the palace to see the king. On that occasion, the brilliant physician, as a visitor, proceeded to explain the variety of different treatments and techniques to the king. And so he explained, I imagine it's not written in here, but he probably explained a whole lot of things about different illnesses and different ways to treat them, and also different ways to rule in the kingdom, because then the next part says that the king replied to him, oh no, this is the brilliant physician saying, "O great king, of course you understand how important it is to distinguish things carefully. This Dharma as such may be used to rule nations, or this Dharma as such may be used to cure illnesses." So the Dharma he's referring to here is to distinguish things carefully, to be very thoughtful and attentive and careful. Upon hearing these words, the sovereign realized at that moment that his physician lacked knowledge of what he was doing. He immediately sent his physician away. Thereafter, he found that his respect for the visiting physician had doubled. Now, on his part, this visiting physician thought to himself, if I want to educate the king, now is the right time to do so. He then turned to the king and said, "Great king, if you truly love me, then grant me one wish." The king answered, "From being here at my right hand, or to any other rank, whatever your heart desires, I shall grant to you." So the king here is offering him status and offering him a senior position. But the great physician isn't interested in that, and instead he says, "O king, although you permit me every possible rank, I would not dare to ask for so much. Instead, what I seek is a royal decree to be enforced throughout the nation, stating that henceforth there shall be no more taking of milk for medicinal purposes as prescribed by the prior physician." Then the king replied, "What you have asked for surely merits no further discussion. I shall immediately issue a proclamation for all the lands in my domain to the effect that without exception, sick people are no longer allowed to use milk as medicine." The visiting physician at that point turned his efforts towards blending ingredients with different tastes to synthesize a number of medicines. That is, he based his medicines on the herbs of pungent taste and smell, bitter, salty, sweet, and sour. With them he treated a range of illnesses, none of which were beyond his skill. Can you hear that cockatoo? So this is interesting, these different mentioning of different smells and tastes of the medicines is, we could see that as the different types of teachings that the Buddha offered to the assemblies when he was alive. Sometimes he offered the teachings of the Four Noble Truths, of the cause of suffering and the liberation from suffering. Other times he offered teachings on the laws of cause and effect. Other times on impermanence, and sometimes on no self. You know, he prescribed the appropriate medicine for the appropriate illness. And that's something that we should also practice in our daily lives, to respond appropriately to whatever is coming up in front of us, whatever appears before us, to respond appropriately, not to respond habitually, not to respond just in the way that's easy for us, but to really reflect and see what is the best way to respond right now in this particular circumstance. So the visiting physician has made all these different medicines. Not long after this, however, and he had been curing people in the kingdom, and people were very pleased with the fact that this visiting physician was so capable of curing so many different illnesses. But not long after that, however, the king himself grew ill. He immediately called for the physician, saying, "I am now seriously ill, racked with pain, and it appears that I am about to die. Can you do something to help me?" The physician divined the king's illness and determined that milk should be prescribed. He then addressed the king and explained, "The ailment that is causing the king so much discomfort is one that should be treated by drinking milk. In the past, I suspended the use of milk as medicine, saying that it was toxic, but that was not the complete picture. If you take milk now, it would be the best possible way of ridding yourself of this illness." The king, now suffering from a debilitating fever, and he should definitely drink this milk. The king then said to the physician, "Have you gone mad? Are you stricken with fever yourself? For you are saying that drinking milk will take away my illness. Before you called it poison, so why would you tell me to drink it now? Are you trying to deceive me? The previous doctor praised medicinal milk, but you called it poison and had me ban it. Now you claim it is the best thing to cure my ills." The visiting physician answered, "When milk is used as medicine, it can have harmful effect of poison, or it can have the effect of amrita, the ambrosia of immortality." And we will definitely come back and discuss this point. After listening to his words, the great king then praised him, saying, "Great physician, excellent, excellent. Today, for the first time, I have understood what is good and bad, beneficial and deleterious, about prescribing milk as medicine." He thereupon drank the milk given him and was subsequently cured of his illness. The great king and the people of his kingdom then proceeded to dance with joy, offering even greater honor and reverence to the physician. The ill all began to drink the milk prescribed for them as medicine, and each found that their ailments were either eliminated or alleviated. So that's the end of the actual parable, but then there's some words of the Buddha that follow next. The Buddha then said, "I have appeared in the world as a great physician king. In the presence of a gathering of kings, I have announced myself, saying, I am the physician king, and out of my desire to subdue false views, I therefore declared, there is no self, there is no person or individual living being, no lifespan, no personality, no observer, no actor, no experiencer. Monks, the prior paths affirmed a self that was false. This is why the Tathagata proclaims non-self as part of the Buddha Dharma. It is because I need to straighten out the thinking of living beings, because I am aware of their situation, that I expound the absence of self. There are reasons why I also expound the presence of self, just like that skilled physician who was well aware that milk may be either medicinal or non-medicinal. But what I am speaking of is not what ordinary people imagine the self to be. Ordinary people suppose the self to be the size of a thumb, or perhaps a mustard seed, or a speck of dust. What the Tathagata explains the self to be is nothing like that. Therefore, when I preach dharmas are without self, in truth, they are not without self. So what is this self of which I speak? If a dharma is true, real, permanent, autonomous, a basis, and its nature is immutable, then that is what I call self. Just like the great physician who correctly appreciated the medicinal value of milk, for the sake of living beings, the Tathagata similarly expounds the presence of a true and real self in the Dharma. This is how your 4 groups of followers should practice the Dharma. So that is the end of the story, the parable. Before we open to conversation, I'll just go over a few points. And I don't know how hard that was for you all to track. I don't know. I remember I found it captivating, but also sort of confusing when I heard this story, and I had to go over it multiple times afterwards to try and follow the story of milk and self. So I'll just briefly describe the process that I went through and go through a couple of points in here. So in the beginning of the story, there's a physician who's prescribing milk. And this is really referring to the historical period of time of people believing in a soul or in a self, a separate self. And in contemporary times, we would parallel that to the identification with ourselves as a separate person from other people, or as a separate species from other species. And that's another move that people make. So that physician really just kept prescribing that medicine for people to believe of themselves as true and real. And you can see that at times that would be beneficial. There's times when we need to really pay attention to ourselves as a separate self. It is very important. So that's why sometimes that milk as medicine really works. But many times that milk as medicine is poisonous. And as we all know from many other studies that we've done, belief in a separate self can bring great suffering. If we believe in ourselves as separate, or if we believe in others as separate, if we think of them as separate, we're capable of hating them, or ignoring them, or of elevating them. So sometimes that kind of milk is poison. So then the brilliant physician comes along and sees that the prior physician was just not able to distinguish the different needs of his patients. And because so many patients had become attached to themselves as a self because of the milk medicine, he asked the king to ban that medicine. And in a way, this is part of what happens to us. We wouldn't use the word ban, but when we're first coming into the Dharma, we slowly unpack all of our habits of mind, of what you could call all the relative truths, the world of appearances. We slowly start to go, oh, things are not as permanent as they seem. Things are not as fixed as they seem. And then we start to hear the emptiness teachings and the Heart Sutra and start to go, oh my God, I'm not exactly what I think I am. I am not as distinct as I think I am. And we sort of slowly but surely over a period of time stop drinking that milk as medicine. We just slowly stop drinking it, and we come to a place often of a real peace, a real settled place. But there is a possibility when we when we do that reflection that we can also get a little stuck in a place of sort of detachment. And detachment is a little different to non-attachment. Detachment is actually losing our sense of empathy with things around us. And sometimes it's described in the Buddhist teachings as being like in a glass tower or an ivory tower where you've separated yourself from all the activity of the world because you've lost yourself in the sense of no self, of emptiness. Sometimes described as standing on the top of 100-foot pole, but you're not there amongst the masses. You're stuck up there on that pole. So this is what happens to the king. He's not been drinking the milk medicine. He's understood no self, but now he can feel that he's a little caught in this place and he becomes ill. And so he calls his physician and says, there's something not right. And then the brilliant physician says, what you need is milk. And this milk, of course, is the milk of the true self, Dharmadhatu, Tathagatagarbha, this all penetrating, unified sense of self. And so when that medicine is then taken, after the medicine of no self is understood, then that is when people become truly well. And when we're truly well, we're truly beneficial. So there was just a couple of spots, though, that I wanted to mention before we open this up. I mentioned that one. Here it says that this milk is the ambrosia of immortality. And I thought it might be just good to mention that that immortality that's referred to there, of course, is not individual immortality. It's the whole point. It's not about individual immortality. It's that we are immortal. It's just a noisy vehicle going past. One of the benefits of living in a caravan in the suburbs is that you're not separated from things, but it can be very noisy. This immortality is the immortality of here and now. We are here and now, not we are in the place of here and now. We are actually the here and now. And you can't destroy now, and you can't destroy here. Here and now is immortal. And when we understand this teaching of the ambrosia, of this sort of milk, we actually identify and feel that we are now. We're not in now. We're not happening in now. We are now, and we are here. So that's the immortality of here and now, which cannot be destroyed. Okay, I think that's enough of my chatter. Would anyone like to ask a question or comment? And you just put your hands in Gasho if you wish to speak. There must be some questions. Didn't you find that story a little confusing? Or was it just me that took a long time to make sense of it all? Scott, you're still on mute.
When I first heard that that story about the milk, which I think I was also in that in the talk with Reb when he gave that talk. And at that time, I did find it really confusing when he first went through that. I didn't follow what he was trying to say exactly, and I felt confused by the end of the talk. I was like, "What? You know, I don't really understand what you're saying about that." Um, and I was confused about the part about, okay, that we must consider that there's a time in which considering that we are a self is necessary and useful, and the idea of recognizing ourselves as or having a conditional self that exists in space and time and is apparently a separate being and apparently a separate mind and so on and so on, and that's necessary to function in some way in the world, a certain way. But it's still not clear to me exactly what the point is regarding the recognition of that conventional self, which is so troublesome in many ways, and which we work diligently through meditation, through koan work, through various means of the Dharma, to see past that traditional conventional self, to see the larger picture of the bowl of the pearl within the bowl, and the bowl with the pearl. If you know that reference to Yuan Wu. And so I just wonder whether you would just go a little bit further to clarify the rightful attitude toward the conventional self that we are often working to transcend. So,
Yes.
thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that in the parable it does say with the first physician that he was actually curing some people by giving them milk, which means there is a place. There really is a place for caring for the conventional self. And quite possibly, I mean, if you were to try to think about it as a ratio, maybe it really needs to truly be about 50-50, really like two sides of a coin. We really do need to care for the conventional self, which just means make sure that you eat and drink healthily and get enough sleep and have companionship and be creative, have a meaningful life, just take some exercise. It really just means that. And I think the reason that in Zen, our Zen tradition, we don't emphasize that so much is because culturally it's so much tipped the other way. It is so much tipped towards whatever it might be. 90% it's about the self, the individual self, and a little bit of almost by accident a sense of community and caring about maybe animals or caring a little bit about forests or something. But it's almost accidental sometimes, it feels.
Yeah.
Or that's how it comes to us through all the different mediums that we interact with the world in. I think people actually just in their community naturally have a greater sense of themselves, but culturally we're encouraged to not. So I think the relationship's probably about 50-50,
Yeah.
and not alternating, but at the same time. At the same time, I remember that I need to drink some water, and at the same time, I remember that there is no me that's really drinking the water. And that's our practice, is to hold these different ways or different aspects of reality, how to hold them in our conscious, not sort of cognitively conscious, but just through our practice, it just becomes our natural way of viewing things. Just like we naturally don't step on a bug when we see it as we're walking, it's there, and we just quickly move our foot away. We don't think, I'm not going to step on that bug. We reflexively don't. That's how we want our practice to be. in terms of self, no self. It's just the way we're thinking now.
Yeah, I think it's possible because I have experience in my own practice that um, it's possible to sort of subtly cultivate this almost antagonism toward toward one's conventional self. Where we're subtly critical of the demands um, um, and the urges and so forth of, of what what we need, as an individual. And I think it's very easy to slip into this kind of subtle antagonism because because many of us are working so hard to transcend that that restrictive sense of just being the body and mind, that we seem to be. And I just wonder whether you would discuss that a little bit, that little subtle antagonism that can occur.
Yeah. Well, I think actually the word transcend maybe is slightly problematic because transcend implies you're here and you want to rise above it and go away from it. And actually we don't really want to transcend our conventional self. We just want to understand and love our conventional self in this sort of bigger sense of the true self. But we should love the conventional self as much as we love anything and anyone, because we love everything. Our love should be non-discriminating. We can't always function that way. We can't function every minute of the day actively expressing our love for every single thing because we have a limitation of 2 arms and 2 legs. But we can have a mental habit of loving everything all the time, and that has to include just our physical body. I mean, I take quite good care of myself. You know, I take good care of myself so that I can do the things that I do. And if I didn't take good care and sometimes set certain boundaries, say, I'm not going to be able to do that thing, I was going to, but I'm clearly too tired, I need to sleep, I'll have to cancel, which actually I don't actually think I ever cancel things, but I take care, I take good care of just this individual self. But we do it always understanding that we are a much we're much faster than that. We still have to do it. So yes, we don't want to have any antagonism or sense of aversion to the needs of the individual self, of the body, or even of the psychological self. Sometimes people need to work on specific psychological things in their own life. They just need to do that, and that's good. Seeing a therapist is a good thing most of the time for people, or having friendships, or having a spouse. I think, Francis, were you going to say something before? Okay.
I think Scott kind of asked, but I was, anyway, it came out through your conversation, but I was kind of wondering about.
Okay.
Thanks.
Emmy?
Thank you for reading that. That was so interesting to me and confounding. Um, I find it interesting when I'm listening to something like that. I've often got not a busy mind, but an enthusiastic mind that wants to predict what's coming next. So when it came to the bit where the king wanted to grant the brilliant physician any wish, in my mind, I was predicting that the brilliant physician was going to say, hey, bring the old guy back. We can all work together. Milk's not the worst. It's just there's so much more. And it was really interesting to me because that taps into my identification with the one cast away, or in my life experience, abandonment. And I think the biggest benefit for me of learning to think about the greater self of us all as one, as well as my own self, is it can help pull me out of um, sort of a victim mentality. If, like, I was left, but I'm not the only one who was left, everyone is left in different ways at different times. And if I am feeling very isolated and alone, it also brings comfort to think that I am that dog, I am that mountain, I am. Do you know what I mean? It's a medicine for me. It's like yeah. So I got a lot out of that talk, and I just find the way your comments so helpful as well. I mean, I don't mean to gush, but like I just get so much out of coming here every Sunday. Well, I'm not going anywhere, but you know. Anyway, ramble. Thank you.
Well, it's nice to hear that you're related to the story, because of course it's hard for me to know how it lands with people, because it is unusual. These early parables are quite unusual, different to the Chinese stories, and certainly different to the contemporary sort of Western stories that we hear. But in relation to this sense of abandonment, I like that you had that thought that you were hoping that the brilliant physician would bring the old physician back. And in a way, he did, because what did he do? He prescribed milk. At the end, he prescribed milk. Maybe a slightly different milk, but nevertheless, he did. And one thing I've noticed with these old stories is they don't try and things all up and make it all look lovely at the end. Sometimes there's some quite difficult pieces. I didn't read out everything actually. But I think that that's probably because it was an oral tradition, and to help people remember, the story had to be quite sort of strong. So you'd have more people being banished, and you know things would be a little more extreme, just to help people remember it as a story. But yeah, in the end, you could say he did honor to some extent that earlier physician, but just in a subtly different way, a different way of seeing this, a way of seeing milk. We just shifted it a little.
And a different dosage.
Okay, I think maybe we will finish with closing chant, which is our Bodhisattva vow. Beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to become it.